Hello everyone, and welcome to another OVA overview here, while the poll for the next retrospective is still ongoing. Can we go 3 for 3 in OVA excellence? Well, not today at least. Well, depending on how you define good. You see, while I don't consider 1996's X to be a particularly objectively good picture, some might. And that's because of its unique role as being one of the most min-maxed productions I've ever seen. Now, if you're not familiar with the term min-maxing, it refers to a strategy in which one stat or attribute of something is maximized at the extent of many other or all other stats. For example, a fighter could have the highest attack in a game, but also the lowest defense. And we see this a lot in this production, where the visuals, the atmosphere, and a lot of the technical stuff is outstanding, and I would argue that the technicals are objectively good. However, the other part of this conundrum, the minimal part, is the writing, as a lot of the writing doesn't make sense, and it's not carried by an, at its core, relatively simple plot. Main issues with the writing lie in the failure to fully flesh out Fuma's questionable motivation, and the failure to successfully craft Camley into a likable or relatable character. Fuma's motivation doesn't make sense throughout the majority of this picture, and Camley is, depending on how you feel about his actions in the OVA, somewhere between melancholic to hypocritical to whiny and unlikable. Yeah, I know he comes around to doing the thing he needs to do by the end of the movie, but the path he takes to get there seems unnecessarily long and tedious, and I don't really think that there is any really good character drama or even character moments in this production when it comes to those two. There's a few fun moments with some of the dragons, and they're honestly pretty fun one-note characters, but as a whole, at least as it pertains to the main characters, it is pretty min here, and that's why I think that this is one of the most min-maxed anime of all time, because on one hand, we have an objectively amazing world, atmosphere, tone, visuals, yet on the other hand, we also have an objectively questionable set of motivations and the objective failure to execute any real character drama, or at least any real substantial character drama in my eyes. I also think I should briefly touch on the fact that while I do consider the visuals and atmosphere and most of the technicals to be the max part of this situation, the audio has some quirks of its own that drag it down a little, mostly pertaining to the dubbing and some sound effects used. Now, the music, of course, is great, although I will say that I can't really use a lot of it here because of the tone of this video, and I couldn't really find a lot of it, to be honest. However, the sound effects do not always fit when they are used, and you can definitely hear a lot of generic sound effects if you listen in closely. In addition, the dubbing is horrible. If you want to watch this in English, that's not a fault of the show, I just think it's funny, although the Japanese dubbing also has issues here and there. Because today's production of X, the 1996 OVA, is almost a perfect example of OVA syndrome. In an effort to construct a massive and detailed and super epic story and universe in under 2 hours, almost everything is botched, at least to some extent, whether it be character development or logical motivations, and we're left with a series of admittedly gorgeous animated frames leading one into the other for about 98 minutes along the way, telling a vaguely coherent plot. Now that may sound a little brutal, but I do want to say that I enjoyed watching this movie, however, in the kind of way that the guys in Red Letter Media enjoy watching movies. I don't think that this is an objectively good piece, although if you love gorgeous visuals, it's still something worth watching. It does have a very interesting vibe to it, and I do think it is gorgeous. I just also feel like it's an objectively flawed piece, and I wanted to say this little disclaimer right now because I didn't hate it, although it may seem like I didn't like it because, well, this is going to be more of an autopsy if I'm being honest. The piece feels meandering, and none of its characters are really particularly likable or developed enough to really reel us in. And while it pains me to say this, I think that 1996's OVA X is a rather flawed piece, and one that I can see why it is a little obscure. Although as obscure anime memories, it is my job to explore these pieces whether or not they're objectively excellent. And this piece is definitely one which is not objectively excellent, or at least in my eyes, whether its failings lie in questionable character writing, poorly explained motivations, and a mid at best English dub. Although I don't hold the dub against it, I just think it's kind of hilariously bad. Now, quick note on this piece before we get into the autopsy. This is an adaptation of a manga by the same name, and this criticism is limited strictly to the 1996 OVAs and the dangers of trying too much in 100 minutes. I say this because the film was intended to stand on its own. It was written before the manga was completed, and I'm sure the manga and the anime adaptation of that, the full 24 episode anime adaptation of that, are much better and more developed than this adaptation of it. In fact, after reading the Wikipedia page about both the manga and the anime series, I'd like to talk about them on this channel at some point, and I expect them to be a much more interesting and perfected product than what I'm about to review today. I also want to say I'm not going to talk about Tokyo Babylon past the point of mentioning it, because I realize it takes place in the same universe and there's a character who appears in like that series in the first 5 minutes of this movie, but other than that, not really relevant to talk about it. Again, I'm sure it's a much more interesting and well executed piece than what I'm about to talk about anyways. In addition, I think that it should be stressed that any good production should be able to stand on its own in a vacuum, regardless of whether or not supplemental material is intended for it. So I don't think it's a valid excuse to say, oh, but this is part of the larger X universe, because, well, first of all, this film was actually intended to stand on its own, and second of all, even if it was meant to be part of that universe, it should still have some merits to reel me in as a viewer without me having any prior knowledge of that series or media franchise. Getting to the plot summary, the movie has a very simple setup and plot at its core. Kamui is a young lad with mysterious powers, and he's given the job of saving the world by his mother. To do all this, all he needs to do is team up with the 7 dragons of the heavens to prevent them from dying at the hands of the 7 dragons of the earth. If they all die, the world ends. As long as one of the dragons of heaven is alive, the power shields protecting Tokyo and the world will remain up, and all will be well. This, and who the 7 dragons of the heavens are, and who the 7 dragons of the earth are directly explained to Kamui and the audience within the first 10 minutes of the film. Okay, this is a good start. We know who's on what side, and what's at stake. We seemed primed for a simple, but enjoyable, magical slugfest. But that's not quite what happens. In spite of Kamui's direct statement that he just wants to protect his friends, and also that humans can control their own destiny, he initially rejects the duty given to him because he, and I quote, won't take responsibility for it, even though that taking this duty is the only logical way to protect his friends, as I don't see how he could protect them if the world, ends. Anyways, this leads him to reuniting with his friends, and they are all quickly drawn into a fight with 2 dragons of the earth. And they are, however, saved when 5 dragons of the heavens show up, and nothing really happens other than Elvira of the earth, I forgot her name, capturing the friends that Kamui swore to protect while everyone else is distracted talking anime fight language. This allows her to convince Kamui's friend Fuma to join her by rattling off some vagaries and showing quote-unquote potential futures that, by the way, don't even happen in the movie, even though he initially says that something along the lines of agency overall and that I'll never join you for these vague reasons, although he does very quickly, and his motivations are pretty flawed throughout the series. Basically, she gets the movie rolling by setting up Kamui and Fuma on a collision course by telling Fuma that Kamui will kill their friend Kotari, who they both swore to protect. Oh yeah, and speaking of Kotari, she implants a magical sword in her, which will be relevant later. What follows is a series of decent to anticlimactic fights in which the dragons of heaven are slaughtered, and Kamui just kind of sits around. He eventually does decide that he should probably save the world. However, by this point, basically everyone else is dead anyways, and he is the sole dragon of heaven left. I guess he is one now, even though I don't remember that directly happening. Anyways, while he gets his act together, his corrupted friend Fuma is also the sole dragon of earth left. If you're wondering what happened to the other dragons of the earth, well, some of them were killed off by the dragons of heaven, although Fuma does kill 3 of the dragons of earth after going full Joker mode. And he also killed Kotari by summoning that magic sword from within her body that I mentioned earlier. Now, why does he need this sword? Well, he needs this sword so that he can fight Kamui and win the battle and do whatever. Again, his motivations are pretty bad. This leads us to the epic conclusion, determining the fate of the world. 2 friends bound by fate to fight. 2 warriors destined to clash in spite of their shared history. 2 souls who cannot help but come to blows. 2 sides of the and it's over. Yeah, Fuma gets beheaded in like the first 2 minutes of this fight, and then Kamui cries while clutching his head, and a rock ballad starts to play over the final scenes, and credits. Yeah, that's just how this movie ends. Getting to this point, this movie is kind of a mess. While its pacing isn't necessarily all over the place, it does have a lot of issues with characters and motivations, as none of the characters are particularly interesting or likable, and a lot of the motivations frankly don't make any sense in context or out of context. And even the fights and simple plot, something which the film should have fallen on, are often truncated and botched in weird ways. And I think this is a prime example of OVA syndrome manifest. Starting with the first point of the autopsy, let's talk about characterizations. Now, in a short movie like this, I think it's perfectly fine to have some undeveloped or one-note characters, because realistically, you only have about an hour and 30 minutes to focus on 2 or 3 in such a short span. There's not realistically any way to flesh out more than 3 or 4 characters, because you need to focus on them if you want to give them good arcs. For this reason, I'm perfectly fine with the multitude of dragons on both sides having pretty one-note or simple personalities. I don't think that's an issue because they're not the main characters. They're just kind of supporting fighters, I guess. And it's not realistically possible to flesh everyone out here, although they do a decent job giving each of the dragons of heaven some defining one-note traits. Like the fact that this one's a stripper and can't wear pants for some reason. Odd decision, I gotta say. Anyways, the dragons are not an issue here. They're fine. The issue really lies in Kamui and Fuma, who I think, are the main characters. Now I say I think because neither of the two are particularly developed, likable, intelligent, or even really get that much screen time. Now, they share the same motivation and are given great power, yet never think to just ignore the orders imposed on them and just not fight. Now, I know that sounds like kind of a cop-out, but let's think about this. Fuma and Kamui have the same magic powers, and apparently their magic powers surpass everyone else's, and they're the key to this whole thing. And apparently they used to be friends, and they share the motivation of protecting Kotari. So why don't they just shake hands and say, yeah, no, let's not do this? What really stops them from happening, other than this really weird, vague dream trip that Fuma goes on that doesn't even really seem to convince him initially right off the bat? Why are we fighting here, I guess is what I'm asking, and this question is never really answered in any satisfactory way, and it makes Fuma feel kind of stupid, I guess. Like, his motivations aren't defined enough for me to really get behind him as a character, and he is quite flawed for this reason. And in addition to this, his relationship with Kamui beforehand was never displayed either, past like a 2-second flashback, so it's not like we as viewers are hit hard by this betrayal. Even if his betrayal made no sense, if there was a bond that we saw beforehand and this was turned upon, we would still be like, oh no, we got betrayed. But since we're not close to Kamui or Fuma and never really see this bond anyways, it's like, who cares? Like, I guess, okay. Kamui himself is far from perfect though, and his characterization is flawed as well. While Fuma does stuff for no logical reason, Kamui doesn't do stuff for any logical reason. What I mean by that is that he takes great strides to not do things he logically should. He rejects his mission because he, quote, only wants to protect friends and not deal with the responsibility here. But how are you going to protect your friends if the world ends? You know, wouldn't saving the world be part of that? And this is even directly stated to his face by multiple characters in the movie, but he just kind of ignores them and says he's got better things to not do. Now, sometimes it can be hard to write a reluctant character without making them seem weak, stubborn, or passive, I guess. And this is a prime example of this. Logically, there are reasons for Kamui to question what's going on here and be reluctant. I mean, this mission is kind of forced on him, and he doesn't really know what's going on, so there are reasons for him to be scared and confused and reluctant. That does make sense. However, how it's handled does not. Because what I think they were going for was a reluctant young man hesitant to take initial action and paying the price for that. However, his hesitance seems to pass a logical extent, and the kidnapping of Kotari should have been the catalyst to get him off of the fence and team up with the Dragons of Heaven. But even after they show him their magical powers and state their benevolent goal, he doesn't do anything for another third of the movie. In fact, he's barely in the movie and just kind of comes off as whiny and hypocritical. In a film of this length, with this many characters and fights, you need to hit the ground running with your protagonist if you really want to give them any kind of development or a good arc. And here, well, Kamui stumbles about, takes 20 minutes to mope, disappears for a bit, and then finally limps it to the finish line. By the time he does, most of the cast being killed. Neither his nor Fumo's motivations or characterizations are really solid enough to get me to care, and so I didn't really. I didn't really like either of these characters, which is not good because they're supposed to be the main characters. And even if I didn't like them, well, you know, maybe they're characters I'm not supposed to like, but first of all, I think I'm supposed to like Kamui, and second of all, even if that was the case, that doesn't work either because I don't really feel anything when they're on screen. Their motivations just make me kind of go, oh, okay, I guess, okay, cool. Next scene. Now, if you noticed earlier, I also made a note on how they also seem to lack intelligence. And we're going to talk about that now here. This movie seems to have a chronic dearth of logic. Now, I'm fine with the setup of magical powers and the necessity of dragons and the power shields. I get it, this is a fantasy piece. I'm not here to question that. And I already spoke about the muddled motivations of the two main characters. So what I speak of here is how the characters' actions don't make sense in this magical context. Now, all the dragons of the heavens need to do, all they need to do to win, is survive. And hopefully, it'd be nice if they could kill the dragons of the earth along the way, but that's not necessary. All they need to do is survive. So why don't they just stick together and murder the dragons of the earth one at a time? Now, I know that's kind of risky. However, if everyone here seems to be on some kind of parity, why not just fight every fight like 5-on-1? Hell, they even do this in the second fight in the movie and prove it's effective, and then just never attempt it again. Instead, they get picked off 1 or 2 at a time when a 5-on-1 fight probably seems like it would have gone a lot smoother? But that gets us to a bigger issue, which is, why even fight? All they need to do is survive. And it seems like the dragons of the earth can't destroy the world without killing them, so why not just, like, run away forever? Like, if you're going to split up because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, then you better make sure that those eggs are in different baskets, very far away and unexpected. But instead, everyone goes to their assigned shield and just gets picked off there. Even when fighting, though, the dragons come off as kind of stupid, and a lot of these fights don't make logical fighter sense either. Why is she still on the train tracks? Why pick a fight with a dragon of the earth who seem to actively ignore you? Why do any of these things? There's just a sheer lack of logic in a lot of these scenes that doesn't make sense and made me actively question what was going on a lot of the time. Now, getting to the fights themselves, something touted as a back-of-the-box feature for this movie, these two are kind of mixed. To give credit where credit is due, the visuals of the fights and the movie as a whole are excellent. However, the fights themselves are kind of meh, and they decline pretty quickly after the second fight. It really seems like they blew their budget on the first two, because these employ a ton of cool visuals and powers and quirks and stuff, and then past this point they get weaker and weaker, culminating in a quick decapitation scene, some soft rock, and a few tears. Now, I don't really mind that the dragons of heaven kind of suck, and them dying easily even adds a little tension to the film as it makes us feel like we're on the back foot. However, I do think it should be noted that the in-fight deaths do seem to get less and less climactic as the film goes on. In addition, I will give the film credit here though, because this also adds a sort of comedic element to the film. It's not a comedy, this is not supposed to be a funny piece, but it does feed into a sort of so bad it's good kind of vibe, which to me the movie sort of became past the 45-minute mark. That's not a good thing, and it does mean the movie's objectively not great, but it also means you can find enjoyment from the movie even if you realize that it is objectively not great. Getting back to the point though, I do think that there is merit to having the chosen heroes fall so easily though, because it does add tension, or at least some comedy to this piece, and I appreciate how all of these deaths do show the fragility of life, something which is apparently a key theme or a key element of this movie. Now, I say this because this is something which is otherwise not well displayed at all. Now, in this movie, the literal fate of everyone in the world is at stake. Very high odds, and yet it feels oddly empty and oddly low stakes. Like, shouldn't all of these building collapses and the possible ending of the world affect more people more drastically? Well, they don't really here. In fact, we hardly see any normal people at all. And it feels like either nobody cares or notices the giant high-rises collapsing in downtown. Where the deaths of multiple dragons added stakes and a palpable tenseness to this movie, the lack of any kind of visual impact on the civilian population or visual civilian deaths detracts from the tension, as it seems like the whole point of the movie is to protect the people, but we don't see the people. And I think this is a rather obvious flaw here. And the movie even acknowledges this, as it does add a few civilian deaths near the end of the movie in an attempt to cover its tracks. However, this is kind of tacked on at the end though, and not really enough to really sell me on the whole people being impacted kind of thing. In fact, the fact that we don't see any real civilian impact here makes it feel like nothing of importance is happening. This feels like just a magical side quest that doesn't really impact the normal world, which is ironic because it is a magical quest which should have a massive impact on the world. But even though the stakes are really high, since Fuma just dies and the world is kind of saved anyways, it makes it feel like nothing really happened. because, well, we don't really see any long-lasting impacts of these calamities which occurred along the way of saving the world. I mean, something really, really, really big did happen, the world was saved, but since all we see are a small cadre of ill-defined characters get toasted, it makes it seem like everything is kind of pointless and not really that impactful. And unfortunately, I think that's how I would describe my viewing experience of X in 1996. However, I don't think that makes this movie a waste of time, and it's definitely not a waste of effort. If you've noticed throughout this video, I have mentioned that I did enjoy the movie several times. Let's elaborate on that now. You see, X is a very serious piece full of a lot of surreal imagery and a lot of artistic mastery, and it's also a piece which seems to lack a little logic in a lot of places and doesn't have very well developed characters. As a result, these two mesh together to create, in my opinion, a very enjoyable film experience simply because of the dissonance in the quality of the technicals and the quality of the writing. It becomes a very gorgeous example of a so bad it's good kind of film. It's enjoyable for reasons that I'm very sure were not actually intended. I had a blast watching this film, whether it was picking apart the questionable motivations or staring at awe when someone gets dunked on really hard, which does happen a lot. And I do think it funny that the film readily kills off its main heroes, which, again, while realistic, also lends a very odd sense of comedy to this film. Something which was not intended, but which at least I took from the film. It's very good at getting you, the viewer, to go, damn! Because someone will just get toasted right in front of you all of a sudden. And in this way, the movie is very fun, even if there are little slow parts, and even if the setup of it as a whole doesn't really make sense due to bizarre character motivation / writing. In addition, the audio is also pretty good too, and the soundtrack itself was something which did stick out to me at various places throughout the movie. And while I don't think it intentional, I also find the ending theme song to be hilarious, because we get a kind of Comb Souser Toad moment where we see this horrible scene of carnage and a seemingly very gentle and relaxing song playing over it. Now again, I do want to state that I know some people enjoy this movie unironically, and they are emotionally impacted and invested in its characters and story, and if that is the case, that's fine. It's just that I personally wasn't, and there wasn't enough to really sell me on this. But if you're personally invested in it, I'm glad you took enjoyment out of this production, because it's an art piece still, and because it is entertainment, and whether or not it entertains you ironically or unironically, if it does either of those two, it has succeeded. So even though I told this film to be a very objectively flawed one, I still consider it a successful one because it was very gorgeous to look at, and I was entertained. Now, I wasn't entertained in the way that the producers intended me to be entertained, but that doesn't change the fact that it was a good use of about an hour and a half of my time. And it doesn't change the fact that I still recommend it to you, whether or not you think that you will be personally invested in the story present. Because if you are, well, then you can enjoy it as an actual movie and take part in a good-hearted attempt to create some kind of dramatic character story. Or if you're like me and you weren't drawn into any of the interpersonal drama or really sold on it right off the bat, you'll probably still enjoy this movie because, well, it is gorgeous, and because the lack of connection I had to any of the cast made it very easy to enjoy it in an ironic sense. I don't mean to be rude to it, it's just that as someone who finds it objectively flawed, I think it's still impressive that I find it objectively enjoyable. And I don't want to make fun of the people that worked on this either, because there is still a lot of heart that goes into it, and whether or not the piece is flawed, gosh darn it, they tried. And if you do want to watch this film ironically, make sure it's the dub. You'll see why when you start watching the movie. So, with that in mind, I do think that this was a fun watch, and it was a good use of time. And if you enjoy it unironically, I think that's great. You probably have a much less jaded heart or mind than I do. But if you are a little cynical like I am, then yeah, it's still enjoyable because of how fun and silly it can be at times, even if it's not intended to be a fun and silly piece. I found great ironic enjoyment in it, and I do recommend you watch it whether you think you'll enjoy it ironically or unironically. I didn't hate it. In fact, I found it enjoyable, and the movie had me laughing by the end. I assure you this is not a mark of quality here. But it did feel a little pointless. I mean, I cannot stress enough how good the visuals are in this movie. And yet I also cannot stress enough how a movie cannot be visuals alone. It's all style here and not a lot of substance, and what you get is a spectacle that ultimately outruns its own luster. Now, I did enjoy the movie to an extent, and I would recommend you watch it if you're interested in gorgeous visuals or just enjoying an obscure corner of anime history. I do think this is something that should be preserved and enjoyed, but technicals alone are not going to overcome questionable or weird writing. I would probably watch this again because, again, I did enjoy it, and if you like it too, that's fine. However, I must say that it is an objectively very flawed, obscure anime memory.